So we turn this afternoon to Armour. The themes and issues that I'll be exploring in relation to Armour today and tomorrow, we'll start with a brief explanation of its corporate structure. I'll then look at the licensing history insofar as relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference and some of the product details. I'll then look at matters relating to donors, selection, screening and pool sizes, and then communication of risk by way of product inserts, data sheets and the like, and to some extent explore interactions between Armour and relevant third parties such as haemophilia centre directors in the United Kingdom. As Mr. Hill explained last week, in early November, one of the hearings in early November, we will be exploring in more detail and across the full range of pharmaceutical companies who imported factor concentrates into the UK, their knowledge of risk and the way in which they chose to respond or not respond to risks in relation to both hepatitis and HIV. And so although the documents that we look at will obviously touch on those issues, there'll be a much more detailed examination of that in November. In relation to Armour, one issue of particular significance is that of seroconversions from its heat-treated product, how it responded to that information and the chain of events and decisions that resulted in the withdrawal of the heat-treated product from the UK market. Again, I'll be touching on a handful of documents relating to that, but that will be the subject of a more detailed explanation and exploration at the November hearing. It's also important to bear in mind that you will be hearing from a witness in relation to Armour, Mr. Christopher Bishop, who worked for Armour in the United Kingdom. He'll be giving evidence to the inquiry in early November. We'll see his name come up in a number of documents that we look at today and tomorrow. A number of themes will need to be explored with him, and you'll obviously wish to hear his evidence before drawing any conclusions in relation to the Armour material. The focus of the material that we look at this afternoon and tomorrow in relation to Armour will be contemporaneous documents, so documents from the 1970s and 1980s. There are a number of secondary sources, books, journalistic investigations, subsequent litigation, subsequent inquiries such as the Creever Inquiry report, which you'll no doubt wish to consider and draw on in due course. But I'll be focusing for the purpose of today and tomorrow on the documentation as it existed at the time. And as Mr. Hill's already made clear, it's an incomplete picture. There's a lot of material that we do have, but there's also, unfortunately, a lot that we don't have. And in that regard, we're very conscious that there are core participants who are highly knowledgeable in relation to the activities of pharmaceutical companies, whether from their own research and investigations or involvement in litigation in the US or here, or both, who may well be able to identify documents that I don't refer to, and we very much welcome any suggestions of any further material that we should consider. So starting with the corporate structure, Armour is an American, or was an American pharmaceutical company founded in 1951 in Kankakee, Illinois, in the States. It prepared, amongst other products, factor concentrates in the United States, which were distributed to the United Kingdom through a United Kingdom company called Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. It changed its name a number of times, and so I'll look at that shortly. The information that we have in relation to Armour's corporate history is largely drawn from a witness statement of a Ms. Samantha Silver. The reference, we don't need to put it up at the moment, show me, but the reference is WITN 3422001. Ms. Silver is a partner in Kennedy's Law, instructed by Armour in relation to the inquiry and provided a statement to assist in setting out Armour's corporate history. And she confirms in her witness statement she's also reviewed relevant material at Companies House for the purpose of providing that witness evidence. There is also a statement from a Mr. Rajinder Bassi. Again, we don't need to put it up now, but it's WITN 6391001, a partner in a law firm called Kirkland and Ellis International, who represent Revlon Inc. in their current incarnation, and Mr. Bassey provided his statement largely in response to the written statement that the inquiry received from Jason Evans. Just looking first of all at Armour on an international plane, since its foundation in 1951, Armour's been owned by several different parent companies. In 1970, we understand it was purchased by Greyhound, and then Greyhound in 1977 sold Armour to Revlon. And then in 1986, the William H. Rorer Group, R-O-R-E-R, purchased Armour from Revlon. So far, so straightforward. The position is inevitably a little more complicated than that. Mr. Bass's statement suggests that a company called Pantry Pride acquired 90% of Revlon shares in November 1985, and that shortly afterwards, because Pantry Pride was not interested in non-cosmetic companies, Armour, together with a couple of associated organisations which I'll turn to, Plasma Alliance and Malloy Laboratories, was sold, he says, to the Rorer Group in January 1986. And you'll recall Mr. Bassey making the point. He says that the current Revlon it was incorporated in April 1992 and has not operated in the Pharmaceutical or Healthcare Centre. Picking up the timeline, in any event, from Rorer's purchase of Armour in January 1986, the next relevant event was in, I'm not quite sure of the date, 1990, a French pharmaceutical company, Rhône-Poulenc, acquired and merged with Rorer, and the name was changed to Rhône-Poulenc-Rorer. There was then, in the mid-1990s, a joint venture between Armour and Beringwerk, the German company, and a joint venture called Sention was set up, and that took over, we understand, the role of supplying factor concentrates to the United Kingdom. Ms. Silver's statement sets out the subsequent corporate history of the parent companies of Armour and Beringwerk, subsequent mergers and the like, but I don't think I need to go into those. For anyone who's interested in following it through to the present day, the statements are available. If I then turn to the particular position of Armour in the United Kingdom, Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited was incorporated in the UK in 1959. In 1982, Ms. Silver's statement suggests that Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited changed its name to Revlon Healthcare Limited, and that then in 1986, when Rorer purchased Armour, Revlon Healthcare Limited changed its name to Rorer Healthcare Holdings. She says that that particular limited company was dissolved in 2010. We'll see as we look through the documents from the 1980s that sometimes the documents reference Armour Pharmaceutical Companies Limited, sometimes they reference Revlon, sometimes the Rorer name appears, sometimes more than one of those names appear on the same document. I should also draw attention to the fact that, again, according to Ms. Silver's statement, at the same time that Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited changed its name to Revlon Healthcare Limited, a new company, also called Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited, was formed, and thereafter underwent several name changes as the parent companies changed. If we just look at a handful of documents, it does appear that Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited remained the relevant operative subsidiary in terms of the supply of blood products in the UK in the course of the 1980s. So if we just look at ARMO 5094, please show me. We see here document from 1982, Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. If we then go to ARMO 40145. I'm sorry, we don't need to look at the text of the document. I'm just seeing how the company name appears over the years. We can see this is now May of 1984. We've still got Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. If we then go to ARMO 40157, this is a product license. We'll be looking at the licensing history in due course, but this is June of 1985, and it's granted to Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. And then, lastly, if we go to DHSC 0002432_033. This happens to be a letter from Mr. Bishop to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in December of 1990. We can still, it is still our Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. So just then in terms of other organisations within the overall group, Meloy Laboratories, MELOY Laboratories Inc., became part of the Armour/Revlon Healthcare Group's Research and Development Division in the 1970s, and we'll see a handful of references to those as we look through some of the documents. And then, probably of the greatest direct relevance, Plasma Alliance, which was a plasma collection organisation, was owned by Armour. So 1975, something called Blood Plasma Services was purchased by Armour. And then Armour acquired further plasmapheresis centres in the States, which were then rationalised into this one subsidiary, Plasma Alliance. And again, we'll look at some of the documents as we go through the themes. As at 1980, it would appear that Plasma Alliance operated 22 plasma centres to collect, test and ship plasma to Armour's headquarters in Kankakee, that plasma being derived from paid donors. And we'll look at the information we have in relation to donors in due course. Just in terms then of where the documents that the inquiry have come from, and again, we're grateful to Ms Silver for the statement that she provides and the explanation she provides in relation to that. It would appear that to the extent that Armour documentation survives, it survives because it was preserved for the purposes of litigation, either in the States or in the UK, and that's Ms Silver's understanding. She sets out her understanding in her statement that during the entire period that Factor 8 was sold, records were kept in hard copy form and archived in Illinois and Pennsylvania, and then rather later in New Jersey. Armour's shipping records predating 1980 were, she understands, that's Ms Silver understands, destroyed in the normal course of business, save to the extent that they'd been retained for the purposes of litigation. Ms Silver's not aware of what Armour's retention and destruction policies were. And so it's not clear how Armour archived documents generally, only that the documents we have, we largely seem to have because they had been kept for the purposes of responding to litigation. We'll see as we look at the documents a number of names as we consider Armour in more detail. Obviously, Mr. Bishop, who I've already mentioned. Some of the names that we'll see crop up will be S.G. Brooks, who was head of regulatory affairs for part of the relevant period for Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited in the UK. W.J. Tarbett, who worked in the registration department for Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. Kay Fitch, Chairman and Managing Director of Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited, Mr. Bishop, as I've already mentioned. And then Michael Rodell in the States, Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Affairs, Revlon Healthcare Group. And then Mr. Robert Christie, Director of Clinical Science at Revlon Healthcare UK and Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. Just to give a flavour of how we will sometimes see more than one company name appear on a document, rather unhelpfully, if we look at ARMO 40374, if we just look at the top of the page, we can see this happens to be a document from April 1985. We've got Revlon Healthcare UK Limited, Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited, and indeed a third company, Burke Pharmaceuticals Limited, on that single document. And then if we go to ARMO 40151, this is August of 1984. We've got Revlon Healthcare UK Limited at the top of the page, and then bottom of the page, Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. So it's not always easy to understand what the precise relationships are, but in any event, they were plainly closely associated companies at the most material time for the purposes of the inquiry's investigations. So with that short and not necessarily particularly clear account in relation to corporate matters, I'm going to turn then to product licensing. The product that I'm principally concerned with is Factor Rate. For the benefit of the transcriber, that's FACTORATE. That was the concentrate produced for the treatment of haemophilia A by Armour in the States. In the period with which we're primarily concerned, Armour was not producing a Factor 9 concentrate for supply to the United Kingdom. There is, and I'll come on to it very briefly, there was a Factor 9 product Mono 9, licensed in the UK in around 1993. But in the 70s and 80s, it's Factor 8 that we're concerned with. And so if we go to ARMO 601, please, show me. We will see here details of the Factor 8 product, which was the first product for which Armour received a product license in the United Kingdom. The product license number, and we'll see it referenced as we go through the materials on a number of occasions, was 0231/0038. This is the application made by Armour for a product license in the UK in March of 1975. The application's in 2 volumes. We don't need to open the other one, but I'll just read the reference out for the transcript. It's ARMO 602, and that second volume contains a number of clinical studies which were provided to the licensing authority. But it's this document at ARMO 601 that we find the most relevant information. So we get a sense of the range of information provided from the index. So section A of the material is entitled Active Constituent. We go over the page. There's then a section on finished products, and we're going to come to particular parts of the application in a moment. We go to the bottom of the 3rd page. We can see the date in the bottom right-hand corner, March 1975, and the application's being submitted by Armour Pharmaceuticals Company Limited. If we go to the next page, and we zoom into the top half of the page to start with, so this is the application form. The proposed licence holder is Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. The role of the proposed licence holder is described as person who imports or procures its importation. And then bottom of the screen, we can see that the name of the product is Factor 8. And this was an application signed by the Head of Regulatory Affairs, Mr. Brooke. If we go to the next page, we'll see the product particulars. We don't need to go through the detail of it, but you'll see there in very broad outline terms, uses, recommended dose, contraindications, etc. We'll see what's said by way of warning shortly. We go to the next page. we can see the heading supplementary particulars, and then manufacture explains that factor VIII is manufactured from fresh frozen human plasma, which when tested is found to be negative for hepatitis B antigen activity. So that's our first reference to testing in relation to hepatitis B, and that's the testing of the plasma. And then we'll see at paragraph C on that page the name and address of place of manufacture assembly. That's Armour Pharmaceutical's manufacturing headquarters in Kankakee, Illinois, in the States. If we turn to page 6, please. Sorry, that was page 6. If we turn to page 16, please, Seamus. There's an awful lot of detailed information in this, so I'm just going to alight on certain points of particular relevance. This is a section about the method of manufacture, description of the manufacturing process, and then you'll see at stage 4, the final product is rechecked for hepatitis-associated antigen. So what's described is a process whereby the plasma is checked and then the final product is rechecked for hepatitis-associated antigen. That is, of course, a reference to hepatitis B. If we go next to page 24, we can see that part of the material supplied to the UK licensing authority with the license application is this document entitled Raw Materials Specifications, drawn up in October 1973 by the manufacturer, so Armour in Kankakee in Illinois. And we'll see, if we just look at the description in the first paragraph, it says plasma for fractionation, normal human, is the liquid portion of whole blood, etc., etc. And then pick it up in the fourth line, drawn from adult humans by plasmapheresis who've not been, I think that says hyperimmunized to produce specific antibodies. And then if we skip down 3 lines, and who at the time the blood is drawn are in a condition physically to give blood, insofar as can be determined by personal history, by physical examination, and by appropriate tests on the day the blood is collected. Just pausing there, there are a number of references, as we'll see in the material, to essentially donor selection processes. And there is a little more detail in some of the later documents than we have here, but it's still not entirely clear precisely what was drawn out by way of personal history, what physical examinations were undertaken. It becomes a little clearer what tests were undertaken on the blood. And you'll see the qualifying words, insofar as can be determined. And then it continues, donors with a history of viral hepatitis or an event of exposure to hepatitis within the normal incubation period shall be excluded. If we go to the bottom of the page, we see a heading, collection and processing of blood. Blood collection clinics supplying human plasma under these specifications and licensed by the US Department of Health, Education and Welfare, Food and Drug Administration must comply with the applicable requirements defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, Part 600. Non-licensed clinics supplying human plasma under these specifications must also comply with these regulations. So that might be thought to suggest that at this point, and this is a document from October 1973, Armour obtained its blood from both licensed and non-licensed clinics. This, I think, predates its acquisition of the Plasma Reliance plasmapheresis centres.
And there's no reference to them owning the clinics themselves?
Not at this point in time or in this document, no. We know that by 1980 they certainly did, but the precise dates upon which they were acquired are not clear. If we go to the top of the next page, the first paragraph explains that blood shall be drawn from acceptable donors by licensed physicians or by specially trained assistants under their direct supervision. Determination of the suitability of the donor is the responsibility of the licensed physicians and must be made by them or under their supervision. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, we can see the heading records. And so this relates to records of donors. Adequate records detailing the medical history of the donor, all physical examinations given him, and appropriate release statements he signs must be maintained. and adequate systems identifying the blood, plasma and serum and correlating them with records supplied to Armour Pharmaceutical Company and records at the donor centre must also be maintained. Records of all donors represented in the plasma supplied to Armour Pharmaceutical Company must be maintained for a period of at least 6 months after the latest expiration date of the products prepared from the plasma. A period of 12 years is recommended. So something of a difference in terms of the magnitude between the recommendation of 12 years and the requirement of 6 months. Over the page, there is further or requirements and stipulations in relation to records relating to shipments of plasma to Armour. So you'll see from the first paragraph they must be accompanied by records that include adequate donor identification, etc. And then if we go to the next page, please. We move to a heading towards the bottom of the page entitled Plasma. Sorry, actually, I should just draw attention above that to facilities inspection, where it says bleeding and processing establishments and all processing equipment and records will be available for inspection during regular business hours by designated representatives of Armour Pharmaceutical Company. So that's an entitlement by Armour to inspect the establishments from whom it obtains plasma. And then the next sentence also explains that inspection will be available by designated representatives of the Food and Drug Administration. And then if we go to plasma properties, we'll see it said plasma for fractionation, and then there are a number of elements set out. And if we go over the page, we see point 7 is, shall be free of hepatitis B antigen as tested on individual units by radioimmunoassay. If we then turn to page 31, this is a further section of the licence application headed Quality Control Checks made at each stage in the process. Stage 4, you'll see from the bottom there, is the lyophilized material is examined according to the finished product specification provided in section 11. It is also checked for hepatitis B associated antigen, so that's presumably a reference to the what we saw described as the rechecking of the finished product. If we then go forward a number of pages, showing it to page 94, we can see here a section of the material with the licensing application headed hepatitis associated antibody. And there is then, if we go, to the top of the page, there is, under the heading biological principles of the procedure, there's a description of the technique used to measure the hepatitis B antigen levels in the serum, using what's described there as a sandwich principle. And then 2 pages further on, showing it to page 96. Under the heading General, if we pick it up a few lines down, it says this: although the association of infectivity and a positive result for hepatitis B antigen is strong, it is recognised that presently available methods for hepatitis B antigen detection are not sensitive enough to detect all infectious units of blood or all possible cases of hepatitis. And then it goes on to explain how false positive results may be obtained and gives a description of 2 different types of false positive results. So that's the most salient parts of the licensing application, the first licensing application made in March of 1975. If we then look at how that licensing application was considered by the licensing authority, and some of the further conditions that were contemplated. We start at DHSC 0105603, please. And if we go to the second page, what we have here is a report from the medical assessor, Dr. Andrews, It's a report dated the 16th of October 1975. We don't need to go to it now, but the date is on it's page 8 or so of the document. We can see that Dr. Andrews here essentially summarises the application. So we've got the heading Summary, Report and Recommendation. And Dr. Andrews then sets out a number of matters relating to the application. If we go over to the 4th page, please, Shomik. We can pick it up at the top of the page under contraindications and warnings. So again, this is still Dr. Andrews' summary of the application. There are no known contraindications to AHF, but the risk of transmitting viral hepatitis is present, since no completely reliable laboratory test is yet available for detecting the presence of hepatitis virus. And then towards the bottom of the page, there's a paragraph headed labelling, and we'll come on to the question of product labels later, and then chemistry and pharmacy. And under the heading methods of manufacture, the report says this blood is drawn from acceptable donors by licensed physicians, and the plasma obtained using plasmapheresis techniques must conform in all respects to the applicable requirements for the source of plasma, human, defined in the USA Code of Federal Regulations. This applies to licensed and unlicensed clinics. A copy of these are not included in the submission. Adequate records detailing the medical history of the donor, all physical examinations given him, and appropriate release statements are kept for a recommended period of 12 years. And then if we go to the next page, we can see under the heading Plasma Properties, paragraph 7.2, again, Dr. Andrews is summarising the application. The plasma is, and point 7, free of hepatitis B antigen as tested on individual units by radioimmunoassay. And then if we go to the next paragraph, paragraph 7.3, he describes there the 4 stages of preparation, and we see stage 4. He summarises the final product is tested for freedom from hepatitis-associated antigen. If we then go, I think it should be 2 pages further on. Yes, so we get the date of the report from here, the 16th of October, and we can see the comment from Dr. Andrews, having summarised the application material for the relevant subcommittee. Dr. Andrews then says this: it's not quite clear who is the supplier of the donated plasma, and then I'm afraid we can't read the next bit. Would appear that this could be a number of units, licensed and unlicensed, which work to FDA standards. It is also not clear whether the tests for hepatitis surface antigen is carried out on individual donations at the time of donation or during the routine examination of patients undergoing plasmapheresis. The company have been asked for information on this point, together with a request for clarification of the place where quality control tests are carried out. It would appear that the manufacture of the product is satisfactory, though the manufacturer has not as yet been inspected. It's not clear whether that's who that's a reference to inspection by, whether it's inspected by the FDA or equivalent, or inspected by the UK licensing authority. And then there's a reference to stability data and shelf life. It is recommended that, subject to approval of the quality control situation, that a product licence be granted. So that's Dr. Andrews' recommendation. If we then turn to DHSC 0105 604_002, we can pick up here the consideration of Armour's application by the Subcommittee on Biologicals at their meeting on the 12th of November 1975. If we go a little further down the agenda, we can see item 5 on the agenda is consideration of applications, and the 4th application is for Factor 8, with the product licence number there set out. And then if we go over the page, we can see the minutes of the meeting. Just draw attention to paragraph 2, confidentiality. Perhaps not so relevant for the purposes of considering the individual licensing applications, but you may wish to bear in mind, sir, when you consider the Subcommittee on Biologicals' July 1983 decision on the question of whether imports from the state should be banned at that point in time. Confidentiality was always regarded as highly important by the Committee on the Safety of Medicines and its subcommittee. And so those who were present at meetings were not supposed to discuss the content of what had gone on at meetings. And you'll see here that reminder being given. Confidentiality, the chairman reminded members that the material they received was of a highly confidential nature and should not be made available to outside contacts. And then if we look at the bottom of the page, section 5 of the minutes, consideration of applications, and that refers to the applications being considered. The consideration of this application is in an appendix to the minutes, and that's at DHSC 0105604_005. And if we go closer, thank you, we'll see then the recommendation. On the evidence before them, the Subcommittee on Biologicals recommend the grant of a product licence for this preparation for the purposes indicated in the application, provided that, and then a number of conditions were set out. 1, information is provided on the number of donations from which plasma is pulled from the manufacture of the product, and then 2, the reasons for and rate of rejection of donors or donations centre by centre. There were a number of other requirements set out at paragraphs 2 through to 5, including product labelling and compliance with the batch release procedure. But for present purposes, it's the request for information about pool sizes and rejection of donors that's most relevant. So that's the recommendation of the Subcommittee on Biologicals. What happened next was that the Committee on the Safety of Medicines considered the application in November of 1975. Date unclear. We don't have the Committee on the Safety of Medicines' actual decision. But they effectively, we'll see from another document in a moment, it would seem approved it subject to those conditions. But this is November 1975. What, of course, then happened was the broadcast of the World in Action documentaries on the 1st and 8th of December of 1975. And this led to an enhanced consideration being given to Armour's product licence application by the licensing authority, with, as we shall see shortly, the involvement of the Minister of State for Health. So if we pick it up at MHRA 0004180, this is not specific to Armour's application, but is a meeting which considers the World in Action documentary. So this is described as a note of a meeting of the Divisional Management Group held on the 9th of December 1975. Not entirely clear what the Divisional Management Group was, but it seems that it was a group within the Medicines Division of the Department of Health. Certainly some of the names, Dr. Harris, Dr. Holgate and others are familiar from that. Just before we look at the discussion on the documentary, flag up paragraph 1.2, which is a reference to the minutes of a previous meeting, where it says it was agreed that the first sentence of the minutes of the previous meeting should read, Dr. Holgate said that shortage of funds inhibited visits to manufacturers' premises abroad. So we'll obviously need to see if we've got the full set of those earlier minutes, but you'll recall Dr. Wolford's evidence. She had a recollection of going on one inspection visit when she was at the Medicines Division. But this would appear to suggest that the licensing authority was inhibited by lack of funds from conducting its own routine inspections to premises abroad. In any event, if we go to the bottom of the 3rd page of these minutes, very bottom paragraph, we see the heading, Blood Coagulation Factors for Haemophilia. Mr. Tringham reported that a television World in Action film had made criticisms of Travenol's production of factor VIII in the USA. The criticisms were in conformity with an inspection report carried out on behalf of the division. So, again, that's obviously dealing with Travenol there rather than Armour. The Minister of State had been briefed, and the Minister of State at the relevant time was Dr. David Owen. and was concerned about the supply of the factor and about the hazards of using it. We go to the next page, we see then Armour is referred to. A similar product manufactured by Armour had recently been cleared by the CSM, Committee on the Safety of Medicines. Supply division were anxious that it should be licensed, as it would be available at a lower price than the Travenol product. There was some doubt as to whether the collection of blood products for either product was satisfactory. Dr. Holgate said he doubted whether inspection of the American collecting facilities would be useful. What was needed was to strengthen the requirements in the product licence and to insist on returns from each collecting centre, including the rate of rejection of donors or donations. So just pausing there, sir, you will no doubt have picked up the reference there to the supply division being keen to have a product cheaper than the Travenol product, and the medicines division there expressing doubt as to whether the collection of blood products for either the Travenol product or the Armour product was satisfactory. And then we pick it up in the next paragraph. The story of the television film was that Britain could be self-sufficient in factors for haemophilia within a few years. The department in 1972 had allocated £500,000 and had bought the equipment needed for production. However, there were some difficulties. Neither of the production units had applied for product licenses. The SHHD, that's the Scottish Home and Health Department, had written to the factory at Liberton, and Medicines Division had reminded HS2 Division that though the Lister Institute of Preventive Medicine, Elstree, had a contract with the department, this did not give them exemption from the requirement to hold a product licence. Mr. Tringham emphasised that his concern was to regularise the situation, not to stop production. The haemophiliac patients group were protesting at the delays in commissioning plant. Supply division were concerned that in the meantime doctors might develop brand preferences for the imported products. Dr. Holgate said that doctors would prefer the British products as being safer. Indeed, once a pure supply is available, doctors will want to use the product in situations in which the currently available factors would be too great a risk. So an insight there into the thinking of the Department of Health as at 1975. If we then turn to how that played out in terms of the consideration of Armour's application for a product licence, we can see from DHSC 0003742 _ 077 a minute dated the 16th of January 1976 from Mr. Tringham in what's described as the medicines branch. It's headed Factor 8 product licence applications, and it refers in the first paragraph to a meeting with Dr. Owen. So we haven't got any other record of that meeting that I'm presently aware of. We may be able to find it, or we may not have it, I don't know. But it says this: at the meeting with Dr. Owen in connection with the television programme about Factor 8, he indicated that he would wish to see any further applications for product licences to authorise the importation of Factor 8. Just pausing there, you'll recall the evidence given by some of the politicians from whom you've heard in the 1980s was very much that ministers would not or should not become involved in the consideration of licensing applications. This, by contrast, is an example of Dr. Owen as Minister of State for Health in 1976, indeed becoming involved in matters relating to a licensing application. So picking up the paragraph, accordingly, we have prepared a submission about the application from Armour Pharmaceutical Company, and we'll look at that submission in a moment. I understand that Supply Division have received a very favourable tender from the company for the supply of Factor 8 to haemophilia centres. Presumably that means a cheaper. But of course, action on this depends upon the granting of a product licence. While the submission was being typed, I received a telephone call from a representative of the company inquiring as to the outcome of their application. I told them that we should probably be writing to them in the near future. In the source of the conversation, I was able to sound the company's representative about their attitude to some of the matters covered in the submission, and I formed the impression that in practice they would be able to accept the conditions mentioned at the end of the submission, but of course this may depend upon the attitude of the American company. And so if we then turn to the submission itself, DHSC 0003742_078. So Factor 8, application by Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited. This submission concerns the application for a product licence under the Medicines Act by Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited in respect of Factor 8, their brand of the anti-haemophilic factor, Factor 8. The application was considered by the Committee on Safety of Medicines at their meeting in November 1975. So, Sir, that's the evidence we have as to the committee's overall consideration. They advised that a product licence should be granted subject to the acceptance by the company of certain conditions. No action has yet been taken on this advice. Summary of application. Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited submitted a product licence application for Factor 8 on the 2nd of April 1975. The application states that, and then various matters are then set out, that the manufacturing takes place at the factory of Illinois, reference there to testing for hepatitis B antigen of the plasma, human plasma being supplied by blood collection centres, licensed or unlicensed, required to comply with the Code of Federal Regulations. If we carry on down the page. Subparagraph D refers to checking the donation for freedom from hepatitis-associated antigen, and E refers to the labelling will contain a warning to the effect that the product is prepared from pooled human plasma, and despite careful selection of donors, it may contain causative agents of viral hepatitis. So that's this ministerial submission summary of the application. Committee's advice...
He refers to non-licensed centres as being outside the USA.
Can we go back up to that?
Non-licensed clinics, that is to say, clinics outside the USA. So that's his understanding
yes.
of that phrase.
Yes, it is. I don't think there's anything in the material I've seen that suggests that his understanding is correct, suggests whether his understanding is correct or not. But we can check.
Yes, I suppose that the question would be whether any clinic is allowed to operate as a centre within the USA without being licensed. If it isn't, then non-licensed would have to be outside the USA, I suppose.
Yes.
Though the question then might arise as to how compliance with the Code of Federal Regulations is checked and monitored.
Yes, I imagine we ought to be able to find out the answer to that, because you'll recall from the licence application material the provisions of the Code of Federal Regulations that were said to apply to unlicensed clinics were set out. So provided we can get hold of the Code of Federal Regulations from 1975, we'll hopefully be able to find the answer to your point, sir. So then, picking up at the bottom of the page, we can see the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, on the recommendation of their subcommittee on biological products, advised that a product licence be granted subject to the following. The first is about the method of assay and standard calibration. And then B is the following conditions being observed. 1, information should be provided by the licence holder on the number of donations from which plasma is pooled for the manufacture of each batch of products, so pool sizes, and the reasons for and rate of rejection of donors or donations. So those are essentially the conditions that the subcommittee on biologicals had recommended, and this submission suggests that the Committee on the Safety of Medicines reached the same view. If we then go down the page to the next heading, licensed action, the submission continues. The normal action on receipt of advice by the committee in these circumstances would be to invite the company to amend their application to incorporate the conditions proposed. If they agreed, a licence would then be issued on this basis. If the applicant did not agree, the conditions could not be enforced without first giving the company the opportunity of appearing before or making written representations to the committee. In view of the Minister's interest, action on the lines has not yet been taken, and we have considered whether any other conditions would be appropriate. And then if we go to the next paragraph and just zoom in. A representative of NIBSC has recently visited the fractionation plant, but there's been no formal inspection by DHSS, either of the plant or of the premises used for collection. In light of experience of inspection of other companies producing blood products in the USA, it is not considered that time and money would be well spent in inspecting the clinics where blood is collected. Inspectors could be shown only the best, and even the worst might be run highly efficiently on the day of visit. While an experienced inspector might deduce the truth, there can be no certainty of this. That might then say...
Seems best.
Yes, seems best to assume that all blood products of this nature coming from the USA may be obtained from plasma taken under the worst circumstances, and any protective measures should be achieved by other means. Top of the next page. The applicants are of high repute as manufacturers. Visits need only be made to the fractionation plant in order to verify the ability of the quality control staff to carry out the necessary tests and assays, and in cases of dubiety to verify the records held at the centre and to ascertain that information supplied to the licensing authority in the UK is substantially correct. The applicant has been required, in accordance with Section 19.3 of the Act, to give an undertaking to permit the premises to be inspected by or on behalf of the licensing authority. If a licence is granted, inspection visits can therefore be undertaken at any time to Armour's premises. This undertaking does not, however, extend to premises not belonging to Armour, in the USA or not, where the donations are taken. It might be prudent to secure a similar undertaking on the inspection of such premises. Both the manufacturing premises and the collection centres, wherever situated, are subject to inspection by the FDA. There are, however, grounds for doubting whether the stringent provisions of US law are in fact fully enforced. In this connection, Dr. Theodore Cooper, US Assistant Secretary for Health, has written to the Chief Medical Officer about US procedures, Annex B. We'll look at Annex B. It doesn't say much about Armour or anything about Armour, but it's of interest more generally. And it should be sensible in the ensuing correspondence to obtain further information on this point. And then the next heading in the submission is source of donations. It may be worth considering whether limitations should be placed on the sources from which blood is obtained. One possibility would be to authorise the marketing of the product only if it is derived from blood given by volunteers without payment. It is understood that over 50% of blood used in the USA is given voluntarily. It seems likely, however, that a restriction of this nature would affect the economics of the supply arrangements and would be unacceptable to the applicant. In any case, it might be difficult to show that, in fact, blood from paid donors is necessarily less safe than from unpaid donors. So that's considered and, as it were, rejected for the reasons given. And then it continues, an alternative approach would be to limit the sources geographically. The licence could relate to material obtained either at 1, licensed clinics in the USA, 2, centres in other named countries, specifically approved by the UK licensing authority. If we go over the page, top of the page. On this basis, approval will be given in respect of other countries if sufficient was known of the local conditions, including enforcement arrangements to give some confidence in the product. The point is that in the USA, each clinic must be specifically licensed. So again, that's the department's licensing authority's understanding. And therefore, presumably, some check is carried out. For collecting centres outside the USA, all that is known is that they're open to inspection by the Bureau of Biologics. But in view of the distances involved, it is unlikely that all centres are inspected regularly, if at all. Such a condition could be combined with the condition envisaged in paragraph 9 as to the undertaking to allow inspection of donation centres, the approval under paragraph 13.2 being conditional on the giving of such an undertaking. Here again...
Seems just a little odd to say in one paragraph they might be open for inspection, but it probably doesn't happen. And then to say, well, perhaps we should ask for the same.
Yes.
But yes. There we are.
Yes, what the practical utility would be in terms of improving safety is...
It's I suppose, better than not having the undertaking.
But whether it actually increases the safety of the product...
it's questionable.
Yes. And then paragraph 16 Here again, it is possible that the applicant would be unwilling to accept such a condition for commercial reasons, but the limitation would appear to be practicable. And then there's a heading General Conditions. There are at present regulations under the Therapeutic Substances Act about the manufacture of blood products. These were made many years ago, but were not of any practical effect until importation began, because they were not regarded as legally binding on the Crown, the only effective supplier. They cover basic requirements, including medical supervision of collection and checking the health of donors. In this respect, they're more stringent than the US regulations, but in general, they're much less detailed and do not incorporate references to modern test requirements. And then paragraph 18 explains that those regulations, the Therapeutic Substances Act regulations, are in any event about to be superseded by new regulations. And it seems desirable that the opportunity should be taken to give effect to more up-to-date and specific requirements on the general lines of the US regulations. Insofar as the products are already subject to these regulations, this will make no practical difference, but it will assist in dealing with products imported direct into the UK from countries other than the USA. And then there's a heading Other Sources of Supply. 3 other companies have product licenses in respect of imported Factor VIII, and 2 other applications under consideration. Brief particulars are given in Annex C. Top of the next page. In addition, Factor VIII is now available from the UK National Blood Transfusion Service. Until recently, the Medicines Act controls were not applied formally to NHS production. Arrangements for its application were promulgated in the summer of 1975. These involved administrative measures in England and Wales and formal licensing in Scotland. In fact, however, at the present moment, no formal action under the Medicines Act has been taken in respect to the preparation of Factor VIII. Although it's not suggested that anything is amiss in this connection, it must be borne in mind that some embarrassment might arise if an applicant were to ask whether the UK product had received the same scrutiny as his product. If any of the additional requirements mentioned in this submission are to be added to the Armour licence, it would clearly be right to impose the same conditions in respect of other similar products. New general requirements as contemplated in paragraph 18 would achieve this result. Alternatively, the companies could be asked to accept the conditions individually, and if they did not, action could be taken under Section 28(3)(h) of the Medicines Act to vary the licences on the grounds that the standards are no longer satisfactory. And then matters for decision. It seems necessary first to decide whether a visit of inspection should be carried out before determining the licence application. If, as suggested in paragraph 6, it is agreed that no visit should be made at this stage, decisions are sought as to whether the company should be asked, in addition to the conditions imposed by the CSM, to agree that A, plasma should be obtained only from donor centres in the USA or in other countries specified in respect of which the licensing authority is satisfied as to the arrangements. B, DHSS inspectors may visit collecting centres. The Minister of State is asked to agree that, subject to the company accepting the conditions proposed by the CSM and conditions A and B above, if he considers them appropriate, a product licence should be granted accordingly. Agreement is also sought to the proposition that, as outlined in paragraph 21, such conditions should be applied to other licence holders. So that's the submission that was apparently sent to the Minister of State for Health, who would still have been Dr. David Owen at that point in time. If we then pick matters up, still in January 1976, we see a meeting takes place with the Minister following his consideration of the submission, and that's at DHSC 0003742_076. So we can see the date of the meeting is the 23rd of January 1976. Present, a number of names, Dr. Owen, Minister of State, and then we've got, amongst others, Dr. Tringham and Dr. Andrews, presumably, although it's not an uncommon name, presumably the Dr. Andrews who'd done the medical assessment for the Medicines Division, and Dr. Waiter, whose name we see on a lot of material from this time. Paragraph 1, the meeting had been called at Dr. Owen's request following his consideration of a submission about an application from Armour Pharmaceutical Company to supply Factor VIII to haemophilia centres. And then we see some matters set out from the discussion. 1, the price being quoted by Armour Pharmaceuticals was 8 pence per unit, which compared with 10 pence and 12 pence from other sources. If a licence was granted, no quantity would be specified, and the haemophilia centres are free to go to any one of the approved suppliers. 2, even though this product was cheaper, it would not necessarily be favoured by doctors because of the fact that as it had a lower solubility than haemophil, it could not be injected but would have to be infused, which represented in itself an additional overall cost. Solubility was one of the essential criteria that had to be satisfied if the medical profession were to generally adopt a Factor VIII product. And Dr. Owen said that it was crucial that the supplies that we were to produce ourselves fulfilled this criteria. At present, the products coming from the Elstree plant were not of a sufficient solubility, and in this respect, they were inferior to the Scottish product. Dr. Owen asked that the Scottish laboratory and Elstree should get together to discuss their processes and to share their technology, and he asked for a progress report on this within 1 month. Over the page, Dr. Owen agreed that negotiations could start with Armour Pharmaceutical, but he asked that it should be spelt out that the overall policy of the British government was in line with the WHO, World Health Organization, recommendation to aim for self-sufficiency. So although this note doesn't make it entirely clear, it looks as though the minister was endorsing the course identified in the submission. And so we see the department actioning that by letter to Armour on the 27th of January 1976 at ARMO 604. This is a letter from the licensing authority within the department to Mr. Brooks, the head of regulatory affairs at Armour. And it says, before determining your application in respect to Factor VIII, the licensing authority requires the following information. And then there are a number of matters set out reflecting the various conditions identified by the Committee on the Safety of Medicines and by the department itself. The relevant ones for present purposes are at B, confirmation that the following conditions will be observed. Information will be provided by the licence holder on the number of donations from which plasma is pooled for the manufacture of each batch of the product, and the reasons for and the rate of rejection of donors or donations centre by centre. So that's the condition that the subcommittee and the Committee on the Safety of Medicines had identified. And then if we go over the page, top of the next page, confirmation that plasma will be obtained only from donor centres in the USA or in other countries specified, in respect of which the licensing authority is satisfied as to the donation arrangements, being premises in respect of which you provide an undertaking that they may be inspected by or on behalf of the UK licensing authority. So that is the condition that effectively emerges as a result of the minister's interest in the Armour application. The response from Armour is at ARMO 605. So a letter dated the 2nd of February 1976. If we go towards the bottom of the page, they respond to the other conditions, which I needn't take up time with. Bottom of the page, the number of donations is approximately 1,540 per batch to give a pooled plasma of approximately 1,000 litres. So that's the information that's provided in relation to pool size. And then in terms of the information about rejection of donors, what's said is this: the rejection rate at blood collection centres is below 1% for accepted donors. The only data available concerns those rejected for blood pressure, temperature, and other illnesses on the day of the donation. No data is available on rejections caused by other medical examinations. So that's the sum total of the information given in relation to rejection of donors.
Centre by centre?
Yes, well, the request has been centre by centre, precisely. And then if we go over the page, thank you, Seamus already there, paragraph F, we confirm that the plasma will be only from donor centres in the USA and from USA sources. Now, the first part of that sentence is obviously clear in linguistic terms, donor centres in the USA, and from USA sources. I'm afraid at the moment, sir, I don't understand what that means.
Well, if it were donor centres in the USA, and from USA sources, meaning people who live in the USA, that would stand to reason. But I think it probably means, as I would interpret it, but I accept it's not entirely clear, other places within the USA where you can buy plasma or obtain plasma.
That certainly would fall within, or be capable of falling within the language. Which
could include, therefore, plasma imported into the USA from somewhere else, wherever.
Yes, possibly. I mean, we'll see what's set out in the product licence in a moment, but that's the correspondence that ensues. Now, whether that may well not be the sum total of the correspondence. We don't have currently a further exchange of correspondence, but it may be that it exists. And again, as Mr. Hill indicated, there are a number of threads that we need to try and follow through and see if we can find out more information.
It could mean other sources than donor centres, which themselves are USA centred, but it's not clear at all.
When we go to the actual licence, the licence more closely reflects the language of the DHSS letter. So if we go to ARNO 40320, please. And if we go to page 7, show it. This is the actual licence granted in March of 1976, so product licence number 0231/0038, granted under and subject to the provisions of the Medicines Act, Armour Pharmaceutical Company Limited, etc. And we'll see it continues for a period of 5 years. And if we just go down, we see the date of grant, the 25th of March 1976, so a few weeks after the correspondence we looked at. If we go over the page, we can see as what I understand to be a schedule to the licence, particulars of the product to which the licence relates. Don't need to go through any of that. And then if we go to the next page, the part 2 of the schedule is further provisions subject to which the licence has been granted. If we look down to paragraph 6, we can see it says information shall be provided by the licence holder on the number of donations from which plasma is pooled for the manufacture of each batch of the product and the reasons for and the rate of rejection of donors or donations centre by centre. So that replicates the language of the condition identified by the Committee on the Safety of Medicines. But what's not clear is whether, in fact, that required Armour to do anything other than it had already done in that letter from February, which was to answer in very general terms the request for further information, or whether there was any ongoing requirement beyond that. We've certainly not seen in the material that we've been able to examine any evidence of the further submission of data pursuant to any kind of ongoing requirement. And then if we look at paragraph 7, we see the condition that was outlined in the ministerial submission. Plasma shall be obtained only from donor centres in the United States of America or in other countries specified in respect of which the licensing authority is satisfied as to the donation arrangements, being premises in respect of which the licence holder has provided an undertaking that they may be inspected by or on behalf of the UK licensing authority. So that, again, replicates the language, but doesn't make clear what in practice it meant beyond the very skeletal information provided in Armour's February letter. So obviously one of the matters that you'll wish to consider in due course, so will be the extent to which this enhanced consideration of Armour's application in fact resulted in any greater reassurance as to the safety of the product.
Yes.
So that's the licensing application, the original licensing application and the grant of the license in relation to Factor 8 in 1976.
Just as a matter of interest, have we any, on that last point, have we any material which might suggest that the DHSS wrote to Armour saying, can you please let us know centre by centre what the rejection rate is and why?
Not that I have seen, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Again, it's possible it exists and we haven't found it, or it exists and we don't have it, or that it doesn't exist. So it's one of those further loose ends that we'll want to try and reassure ourselves as to, but there may be no answer.
Well, I can understand why we might not have a document which is held, or one would expect to be held by Armour. But if it was sent from the DHSS here in the mid-70s, you'd expect at least a carbon copy of it.
Yes, although we know that there are some DHSS materials that have never been found, and that was apparent from the evidence we heard from Lord Glenarthur, Lord Clark and
Yes.
Lord Fowler. But it may well be that there is further material, but currently we've not got it, or not found it. Now, if we then look within this same document reference, Shamik, to page 5, we'll see that over the following years, this is paragraph 10, there were a number of subsequent variations to the licence. You've got the dates there, variations by letter. We don't have a clear understanding, I'm afraid, of what those variations are. I've seen an example of one which is not of any great moment. I think it was about the methods of reconstitution. But in any event, there were variations from time to time. If we then go to the second page of this document, we can see that a renewal of the product licence, so you'll recall the date of the grant was the 25th of March 1976. It's then renewed. Date of renewal is the 25th of March 1981, so 5 years on. The oddity is that if you go further down, the renewal is dated the 31st of July 1984. And I'm afraid we don't understand at present why that's the case. In any event, the schedule, which appears to be attached to this product licence renewal, is on the next page. And if we go one page further on, this is in the particulars of the products to which the licence relates, paragraph 6. We'll see their reference to hepatitis. Factor 8 is prepared from human plasma, each donation of which has been found negative for hepatitis B surface antigen by the radioimmunoassay method. In addition, this lot, after reconstitution, has been tested and found negative by the RAA method. However, since no completely reliable laboratory test is yet available to detect all potentially infectious plasma donations, the risk of transmitting viral hepatitis is still present. So that's Armour's first product, Factor 8. I'm going to turn next to the second plasma product for which it sought and obtained a licence, which was high-potency Factor 8 in 1978. But perhaps, given the time, we can come on to that.
Well, let's take a break and come back at 20 to 4. I hope that gives everyone enough time. 20 to 4.